Hello, and welcome to the Cardinal Point Perspectives. In this series, we're going to be talking about the Bretton Woods traps. In episode one, we're talking about why the IMF's medicine has never cured a single African economy. We want to talk about the track record of the IMF programs in Sub-Saharan Africa, from structural adjustment in the 1980s through today. Zero countries have graduated from the IMF program, or what we call the IMF dependency, after completing all conditionalities of the programs. We want to examine why the model produces this outcome by design and not by accident. I want to start with a number, and that number is 608, 608. That's the number of loan commitments the IMF has made to African countries since 1982, 1952. 608 times an African government has walked in to negotiation with the fund, accepted a program, implemented the conditions, cut subsidies, floated the exchange rate, retrenched the civil service, and waited for growth to arrive. The typical African country has gone back to the IMF at least 12 times, 12 separate programs. Some countries have done 20 or more. And as of December 2024, 30 African countries still have outstanding loans with the fund. Think about that. 30 countries right now still on the program. After this relationship, the question that a rational person will ask or has to ask is, at what point does the patient fire the doctor? Because here's the thing. If you take the same medicine 40 times and the illness keeps coming back, the problem is not your commitment to the treatment. The problem is the medicine. Or more accurately, the medicine is treating the wrong disease. Again, my name is James Colley Jr., and I've spent the better part of 2 decades working in African public finance, first as a senior official in the Liberate's Ministry of Finance and Development Planning, and later in private sectors and advisor on tax policy, infrastructure transaction, concession negotiations, and other regulatory matters across different areas. I've sat in a room where these programs get negotiated. I've watched what happens after the press release goes out and the cameras leave. And I will tell you what I've seen. I've never seen an African country complete an IMF program and graduate, not one. Not to a place where the fund packs up, shakes hands, and says, you no longer need us. Does not happen. That's what this podcast is about. It's not about the theory of development, but rather it is about the practice. The specific mechanisms by which the current development architecture keeps African economies dependent, and what different choices will look like. We want to examine that. And so again, I say welcome to the Cardinal Point Perspectives. Let's go back to the beginning of this relationship, because you can't understand where we are without knowing how we got here. The 1970s were genuinely difficult for most African economies. The oil price shock of 1973 drove up import prices. Commodity prices for African exports fell. Government spending outpaced revenues. Countries accumulated extended debt. By the late 1970s, foreign exchange reserves were draining fast across the continent. Enter the IMF and the World Bank with a solution: structural adjustment programs. They call them the SAPs. The prescription was consistent across every country: cut government spending, remove price controls, liberalize trade, privatize state enterprises, float the exchange rate, and stabilize inflation. Do all of this, and foreign capital will flow in. Efficiency will improve, growth would follow. By the mid 1980s, nearly every country in Sub-Saharan Africa was under some version of this program. Now, today, the World Bank has its own study from 1992 asking why structural adjustment failed in Sub-Saharan Africa. The World Bank's own study, published in 1992, they title it Why Structural Adjustment Has Not Succeeded in Sub-Saharan Africa. The institution designing the programs was publishing papers about why the programs weren't working, and then continuing to design more programs. What did the adjustment actually produce? Look at the 1980s across Sub-Saharan Africa. GDP per capita fell in most countries. Public health spending dropped sharply because government cut social expenditure to meet fiscal targets. Educational enrollment declined. Infant mortality actually increased in several countries that were under adjustment. Zambia's copper belt collapsed under liberalization. Ghana went through multiple programs and remained aid dependent throughout. Cote d'Ivoire, once considered West African success story, ended up with debt ratios that made further borrowing unsustainable. The program defenders would tell you this happened because African governments failed to implement the reforms properly. That's the standard response. Blame the patient for not following the prescription. But here's a structural problem with that argument. If the same prescription is given to 40 different patients across 30 years and 40 different political contexts, and the outcome is consistently poor, the common variable is actually the prescription, not the patient. The conditions attached to IMF programs are not neutral technical requirements. They carry specific theory of how economies develop. That theory says that government intervention distorts market, that private capital allocates resources better than public investment, that external trade liberalization improves efficiency, and that macroeconomic stability, defined as low inflation and balanced budget, creates the environment for growth to emerge. That is the theory underpinning the solution. That theory has never produced a developed country, not one. The countries that industrialized in the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, all of them used high tariffs, state-directed investment, industrial subsidies, and active government intervention to build their industrial base. They did the exact opposite of what the IMF prescribes for Africa. The IMF knows this. Their own economists have written about it. So why does the prescription not change. Why we keep doing the same thing? Let me make this concrete with three examples from the last 5 years. Zambia. In 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its extended debt during the COVID period. It completed debt restructuring negotiations in 2023 and entered a new IMF program worth approximately $1.3 billion. The conditions? Cut few subsidies, reduce the budget deficit, raise domestic revenues through higher taxes. And critically, the IMF specifically targeted Zambia's farm import support program, which have been providing agricultural inputs to millions of smallholder farmers since 2002. The IMF required Zambia to reduce funding to that program from 3% of GDP to 1% by 2025. Researchers have directly linked that cut to the hunger crisis that hit Zambia in 2024. Zambia borrowed money to stabilize its finances, and one of the conditions for getting that money was to stop feeding its farmers. You cannot make this up. Let's look at Kenya in 2024. The Kenyan government attempted to introduce new tax measures required under its IMF program. Those measures included new levies on basic goods and services. Kenyan citizens took to the streets. The protests grew into one of the most significant civil risings Kenya has seen in decades. Young people stormed the parliament building. At least 24 persons were killed. The government withdrew the finance bill, and the IMF representatives sitting in Washington continue to publicly support the fiscal consolidation agenda. The IMF prescription triggered social crisis, and the IMF response was stay the course. Let's look at Ghana. Ghana entered an IMF program in 2023 after defaulting on its extended debt. It was the first default in Sub-Saharan Africa and Ghana's 17th program. 17. A country that has been under the IMF programs with interruption since 1966. Ghana has cocoa, Ghana has gold, Ghana has oil. Ghana has a relatively educated population and a functioning institutional structure compared to many of its neighbors. And after 17 programs, Ghana needed a bailout. The pattern across these three countries, and you could substitute Liberia, Mozambique, Cameroon, or almost any other sub-Saharan African country into the same analysis. It's not accidental. When the standard response to a country's economic difficulty is the same package of fiscal tightening, exchange rate adjustment, and subsidy removal, regardless of that country's specific economic structure, you are not doing diagnostics. You are running a conveyor belt. Now, I want to be precise about something. I'm not saying the IMF is staffed at billions. The people who design these programs are technically competent. Many of them genuinely believe in what they're doing. The problem is institutional, not individual. An institution that was designed primarily to manage balance of payments crisis for industrial countries and was now repurposed to manage structural development challenges in low-income countries will consistently produce wrong outputs because the two doesn't fit the problem. The deeper issue is who sits on the IMF's board and holds voting power. The United States holds about 16.5% of voting rights, enough to block any decision requiring an 85% supermajority. The G7 countries collectively control over 40%. Sub-Saharan Africa, 54 countries, holds less than 6%. The institution making decisions about African economies is governed primarily by the countries that benefit from those economies remaining in a particular position in the global division of labor. That's not a conspiracy. It's just an incentive structure. The incentive structures produce predictable outcomes. So, what does a different path look like? Because I don't want to be a critique without a direction. The first thing African policymakers need to do is separate the financing question from the policy independence question. These are two different problems that keep getting conflicted. An African government can need extended financing and still refuse to accept conditions that contradict its development strategy. That requires having a clear development strategy in the first place, which too many African governments lack. Look at what Ethiopia did with its industrial development. The government built industrial parks, provided subsidized utilities and land, offered tax incentives structured around export performance rather than just entry, and used state-owned enterprises as anchors. This is not an IMF playbook. Ethiopia's approach drew on East Asia developmental state model much more than on Washington consensus prescriptions. And for about 15 years, Ethiopia ran some of the highest growth rates in Africa. Ethiopia has its own serious problems, including a devastating civil conflict. But the economic architecture that produced that growth came from deliberate state-led industrial policy, not from structural adjustment. Morocco is another example worth studying. Morocco controls roughly 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves through the Office of Sheriffendi Phosphate, which is state-owned. Rather than simply exporting raw phosphate rock, Morocco has been investing in processing capacity and moving down the value chain into fertilizers and phosphate chemicals. They are capturing a larger share of the value their resource generates before it leaves the country. That is resource nationalism done with strategic sophistication, and it is working. The second thing African policymakers need is a different financing architecture. China's Belt and Road Initiative has real problems around debt terms and contract transparency. But the principle of using infrastructure financing tied to resource-backed repayment is not inherently bad. The problem is when African governments negotiate those deals without adequate legal and financial capacity in the room. Private capital is available for African infrastructure at scale. Pension funds, sovereign wealth vehicles, and development finance institutions collectively manage trillions of dollars looking for investment opportunities. The barrier is not that capital doesn't want to come to Africa. The barrier is the risk perception, which is partly real and partly constructed by ratings agencies and financial institutions that apply different standards to African sovereign debt than to comparable sovereign risk elsewhere. African governments that have done the work to create credible regulatory environments and bankable project structures, Rwanda being the clearest example, have managed to attract private capital on terms that work. This is replicable. It requires serious investment in destructuring capacity inside government, which is where the African Union, regional development banks, and continental institutions should be putting resources. The third thing, and I will come back to this in a later episode, is tax. African governments give away more in tax incentives to attract investment than the investment generates in economic returns. The data on this is overwhelming. You cannot build a state on a tax base that you've signed away in investment agreements. Fixing that requires renegotiating some agreements, redesigning the incentive architecture, and building the revenue authority capacity to audit complex corporate structures. It's not easy, but it's available. And here's where I learned on episode 1. The IMF has run over 600 programs on the African continent. 30 countries are on the program right now. Not one has graduated to the point of no longer needing the fund's support. If this were a hospital, 600 patients have come through over 70 years, and the hospital's own studies said the treatment wasn't working, and patients kept returning sicker each time. We will not say the patients failed to comply. We will shut the ward down and redesign the treatment. African policymakers who continue to treat IMF program completion as the primary measure of economic policy success are managing to the wrong metric. Completing the program is not the goal. Building an economy that generates sufficient domestic revenue, finances its own infrastructure, and raises the living standards of its people is the goal. Those are different objectives, and the program often actively works against the second set. That does not mean African governments should walk away from all multilateral agreement. It means they need to engage from a position of strategic clarity rather than financial desperation. And building that position requires investing in domestic economic capacity, revenue mobilization, and the kind of deal structuring expertise that can sit across the table from IMF negotiating team and push back. That's the work. And that's what we're going to keep talking about on this channel. Again, I'm James College Jr., and this is the Cardinal Point Perspectives. If this conversation matters to you, I want you to share it with someone who needs to hear this. Again, we'll be back. Until then, make your comments below, share this, and subscribe for more content like this. I'll see you next time.